person watching this. Hope this video finds you well. Welcome to Musical Exploring Music with Kalyani. Today we are into the second episode of this 3-episode short series East Meets West. While in the first episode we had a look at the fundamental aspects of Western and Hindustani classical music, it must be appreciated that these two kinds of music have evolved from very different cultures, and therefore culturally they differ a lot. To elaborate on these differences and a couple of similarities, we have someone with us who is an expert of the subject, Reena Esmail. Let me give you a short introduction to Reena. Reena is an American composer and she has been learning Western classical music since her childhood. She has also obtained training in Hindustani classical music since the year 2010. She has come and stayed in India for the first year of her training. Along with the technicalities, she has also closely studied the cultural aspects of Hindustani classical music. She has done her doctorate in music from Yale University, where she presented her thesis titled Finding Common Ground, Uniting Practices in Hindustani and Western Art Musicians, which explores the methods and challenges of the collaborative process between Hindustani musicians and Western composers. In one of my previous videos where I spoke about the audience participation in Hindustani classical music concerts, I had quoted a small paragraph from an article authored by Reena, which was published on New Music USA. This article made very interesting cultural observations about Hindustani classical music. I've put a link to that video and that article in the description. Do check that out if you're interested. Ever since I read that article, I had been very curious to know about how, as a Western musician, she perceived Hindustani classical music, and today I'm very grateful that we have her with us to discuss more about this topic. Hi Reena, welcome to Musical. So, as a reader of your article, the first question that came to my mind was, as someone who has been in the habit of reading and writing music since her childhood, how did you perceive a tradition where performances were made for hours together without looking at a piece of paper?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because, like you said, I was trained, I'm a pianist. I was trained, in Western classical composition. And for us, if there is half an hour of music, there is a book that accompanies that has every single note that every single person is playing. And so, yeah, to come to a concert where there is no music, my first question is like, where is that music coming from? From someone who has a tradition where I know exactly where each note comes from. But it's really fascinating because I was able to understand how the music that sometimes takes me months and months and months to generate, someone can kind of generate on the spot with a different training. And in a way, what at first I found so mystifying, I now find very liberating because, now I work in situations where I'm working with Hindustani classical and Western classical musicians together. And for a Hindustani musician, I might have to write one note. And then for a Western classical musician, I might have to write 25 notes to get the same effect of writing one note for a Hindustani classical musician.
Right.
There are so many nuances that can be produced when you're working just improvisatorily. So, there are interesting drawbacks and there are interesting benefits to both systems.
Right. So, when you learned Hindustani classical music, how difficult was it for you to adapt to that freestyle kind of performance?
This is what is so funny is that there were many things that were very difficult for me about Western classical music. But, growing up in the US and growing up as a child of my mom is Goan. So, she, introduced me to Western classical music because that was how she had grown up. And so, there were things that were very difficult for me. And one of those things was what we call sight reading, right? Looking at a piece of paper and it has the dots on it, and you just have to play those notes in that order. And I would always struggle with that. I had a good ear and I always liked to use my ear. So I would end up just memorizing things, because I couldn't read it fast enough off the page. And I cannot tell you how relieved I was to come to a tradition that you learn everything by ear, and then you kind of
Right.
get to memorize it and then improvise on it. And so I thought it would take me longer to assimilate. I thought I would be really scared. And I think for some Western musicians, they are very scared. But for me, somehow it felt a little bit like just unlearning Western music, and some of my natural tendencies were naturally much more Hindustani. Just by chance, it happened to be that way.
All right. So the system of learning with the ear kind of came to your rescue as a blessing in disguise.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other thing that I will say that is maybe more of a cultural thing is that, because, I am an Indian looking person. And I think there is something about, training in a system where the teachers look like you and they train other students who look like you do, where my teachers always
Right.
believed that I could do it. Right. There was never, they never thought that I wouldn't be able to learn it. And I think some of it just did have to do with the fact that I am biologically Indian. And so then I went back to the US and I actually realized that some of that was working against me because I'm not European. Sometimes people would question my ability in Western classical music, where I have
Okay.
much deeper, I mean, I've just studied it for 2 decades longer than I have Western classical music, so, or Hindustani music. So it's interesting.
As a student of both the schools of music, how do you think is the training process different in Hindustani and Western classical music?
Yeah, this actually ties into the last thing that we were talking about, which is that the training process in Western classical music, there's much more explaining. So, a teacher will say, okay, this is how you place your hands. This is what you do. This is why this is related to this. There's a lot more questions and answers and back and forth, especially in training for composers. We spend a lot of time talking about things. And in Hindustani music training, there is not a lot of talking. You sing, teacher sings the phrase, you sing it back. They keep on singing it, you keep on singing it back. And it's
That's
a
right.
saval jawab style teaching, which just does not exist in Western music in the same way. So, I
That's
mean,
right.
it's a hybrid system where I think both are really valuable, because sometimes there are nuances that cannot be picked up from talking about it or from notating it, that you can only really just hear and repeat back. But then in another way, it's really nice to have some explanation sometimes, that you might not get in Hindustani music, and you might realize years later, oh, this was just this. Why didn't someone just tell me?
That's right. So, in your answer to the previous question, you said that you were obtaining training as a composer. Right. So, in Hindustani classical music, we are trained as performers. Of course, when the performer is performing, he is making his impromptu compositions on the spot. But I would like to get some insight on how composers are trained in Western classical music and how that training process is different from that of the performers.
I actually think even Western musicians wonder that question, because those who are trained as performers also have no idea how composers are trained. It's a
Okay.
mystical process, because essentially you're trying to get inside a person's mind and figure out what they're thinking, and then figure out almost how to get them to go in a direction that their mind is maybe can't quite conceive yet. And so I will say that, I mean, most composers, their training begins as performers, so you learn how the music works from a performer standpoint, but
Hmm.
then you kind of see behind things, because a composition, and we were talking about this earlier, a composition in the Indian sense is a composition of a single melodic line. So it's usually something
That's
that
right.
you can sing, and you can, even if you can't write it down, you can render the entire thing yourself. For
That's right.
Western musicians, composition can be for an entire orchestra. There could be 80 people, and you have to figure out how all those parts kind of work together. So you have to be able to hear things really differently and in many, many layers, in a way that, in Hindustani music, you just hear it all in one layer, but that layer is very complex. And
That's right.
so basically, when I teach students, what I try to do is just start with these really big ideas, and start with, okay, what's the feeling of this? And then, okay,
Hmm.
what are the kind of instruments that make that feeling? And then, okay, how can we do like a little instance of it? And then how can that kind of work its way into a bigger form? So all of
Right.
that is just training of craft, but ultimately it is just creativity, and just people having these creative ideas by listening to a lot of music. And that's true in Hindustani music as well.
That's right. Reena, another parallel line which I could draw is that you in Western classical music have these legendary composers which you have to learn and exactly reproduce what they have composed, right? In Hindustani, on the other hand, we have bandishes composed by people whom we don't even know, we don't even know their names. Then there are some bandishkas who have put their takhallus in the bandish itself, so we know their names. But different performers perform the same things in their own style depending upon their liking and comfort. And then there are also modern bandishkas who are exploring their creative potential through modern bandishes. So what is your take on this?
So in Western music, we also have that same thing. We have these really old pieces that are written by composers of Bach, Beethoven, hundreds of years ago, and the thing about those pieces is there maybe they each have a series of notes that you would have to do exactly the same way, and maybe the only difference would be that you take a little bit more time in a certain phrase, maybe it's louder or softer. There's just very, very fine interpretive choices that I think if you were a Hindustani musician and you were listening to different recordings of the same Beethoven symphony, it may be very hard for you to hear the differences because exactly. And then the differences in Hindustani music, you have a bandish, and then bandish just incorporates a very small portion. You sing the bandish, and then the rest is improvised. It's really up to you. So I think in a certain way, Western music, once you write it down, it is there and it exists, and you have to kind of contend with it. So the tradition seems to shift a lot quicker because when you start singing, say, rag bihag, it is up to you to kind of render that bihag in a way that makes sense and recreate it for the audience, regardless of what the bandish is or not. With Western composers, once a Beethoven symphony has been written, you're always just going to perform it the same way. So the next composer has to be that much more different just because they're kind of moving the tradition forward. So you'll see that Western music, I mean, quite frankly, the more I understand about Hindustani music, the less I understand what Western music even is, because Western music could be something for an orchestra. Western music could literally be someone like pouring water into a piano. I mean, that is actually a piece of Western music. So, it's there are just so many variations on what Western music is, in a way that Hindustani music always does have to preserve those rags and render them in a particular way.
So, Reena, when you came to India and attended concerts, what were the differences you observed in the approach of performers as well as of the audience?
There are so many amazing differences. One, I think the most obvious was just that the audience is much more actively participating. The audience is kind of in the light, the performer sees them, and they will actually kind of say things after each phrase, which you would never expect in Western music. You would be so scared if something came out of the audience. And of course, there's so many other things I could say, but I actually have a whole series where I discuss this. It's called Overtones. And, my colleague Saili Oak, who is a Hindustani singer, and I go into all these kind of interesting, awkward moments that happen culturally and socially when you're combining different kinds of music.
Yes, so for the viewers, I have put the link to Overtones in the description. Irrespective of whether you are a Hindustani musician or a Western musician, or you are not a musician at all, it's a must watch. Coming back, Reena, when you attended concerts, what were your observations about the audience demographics? Like in Hindustani classical music, it's either the students of music or the grey hair audience that flocks at a concert. And why improving this demographic is important, I feel, is because the more variety of audience you get, the more chances of your art form surviving and flourishing. Right? Like, I'll give you a very small example. You go and watch a film. While you're watching the film, you don't necessarily know the technicalities of direction, costume designing, cinematography, and so on and so forth. But still, you see the final product on the screen and you like that product. And that's why you go for the next film of the same actor or same director. Now, this element seems to be missing in Hindustani classical music, at least. I mean, people will say, I don't attend concerts because I don't understand what is going on the stage. Right. So, how do you perceive the scene with Western classical music? Is it the same or is it any different?
You're right that it's really similar, because in Western music, we have the same thing. We have audiences that are much older. And then we also have any younger audience will usually be someone who is studying Western classical music or has studied it really deeply. And I think one of the things, at least for Western classical music, that feels true to me is that there is almost a cultural thing where, younger people will want to go to concerts where they can kind of just let loose and be free and, hang out with their friends. And, it feels like a more of a social event. And this is specific to Western classical music, is that you have to be completely silent. Like we were saying before, you have to
Right.
be you're in the dark. You really don't matter. You being there is you just having an experience that is not, you're not interacting with the performers at all.
Right.
And so I just think that younger people don't really necessarily feel valued or feel like they're having a dialogue when they're able to be at a Western classical concert, in the same way they might feel when they're able to go to a popular concert or something. But I
Right.
mean, I think another point that you make is really true, that having the context, and I mean, I guess maybe having the education, but maybe more exactly what you're doing here, on this series, which is that we're having discussions about things that, obviously we both, have studied music in our life, and we both know the
Right.
technicalities behind things. But you're right, it doesn't mean that someone who is going to listen needs to know that, but they do need to kind of know what to expect, and even to know the people behind it. And so, for me, I realized that I am my music, and people might have a relationship with my music, but it also helps sometimes when they can put a face to the name. It helps when, they see me on the stage and they feel like they know something about me, and I'm not just some disembodied sounds. I'm really just a person like them.
Right.
And I think that's what pop music definitely has done. You do feel like the person, or you feel some identification with them. And I think, sometimes our training will prevent us from making those connections sometimes, because I can imagine, like a young Hindustani singer thinking, okay, I've got to get this series of tans perfect. And they're so focused musically, which is fine, but then it might not quite read the same way to an audience. You don't necessarily learn that kind of warmth. And I think you learn it more in Hindustani music than you do in Western classical music. I mean, Western classical musicians come out and they don't have any, they just play and they leave. And I think
Right.
we can do a lot better in that way.
Reena, do you think that making these kinds of music more accessible and relatable to the layman can help these arts grow in a better way?
Absolutely. And I think, even more than that, more than just accessibility, is relationship. I think about who
Right.
I'm writing for, And so for me, for example, my music usually is mostly written for professional musicians. So you would have to
Right.
really have some training to perform my music. But I've been thinking recently, okay, I have a piece that's done by an orchestra or something. What is the student version of that piece? What's something that's a little bit easier
Okay.
that I can pull out of that piece, that maybe someone who's, in third grade could play a little melody
Hmm.
from? And so I try to think about it on the human level, because ultimately, if someone feels like they're being connected to as a person, then having that musical connection and spending the time to really get to understand the classical arts, which are honestly a little bit harder to understand and a little harder to appreciate than the popular arts. They're not designed for that same commercial, immediate grasp. But sometimes you need something to stick with it a little bit longer to actually get that benefit.
I absolutely agree with you here, full 100%. And that brings us to the next topic of our discussion, where I have two questions for you. One is that when I was in school, we had music as a subject, but only as a grade subject. So you would just have to write something for 10 marks and you would pass. Is it the same in the Western world about Western classical music, or is there any difference? And my second question is, how can music be made more enjoyable and interesting in the school itself? Like, for example, even if you are not a painter, you will sit in the painting class and you will paint how much ever you can. You basically enjoy it, right? So, can something similar be done in the field of music as well, so that everybody gets a basic training, and then if there is a musical talent, it emerges and pursues music further. Like, I'll give you a parallel example. Nobody is born a scientist. You get the basic training or basic knowledge of science in the school, then you start liking it, then you pursue it, you take higher education in it, and eventually you become a scientist. Similarly, can musicians be identified and cultivated through a robust training process? Another benefit of such a system which I see is that even if you don't become a scientist, for example, you learn to appreciate the scientific phenomena that are happening around you, right? So similarly, even if you don't emerge as a musician or as an artist, you can definitely be a good critic or appreciator. So the question is twofold. One, is the situation any different in Western classical music as far as the scholastic training is concerned? And two, if it is the same, what can be done to improve the situation?
So, I mean, yeah, to answer the first question, I do think it's very similar in that, we have a variety of programs for young people and a variety of educational programs. But I think if you go to a school, it depends on the kinds of resources that your school has as to what the kind of music education you get. So, look, if you go to a private school where the parents have a lot of money, and especially, I live in Los Angeles, so there are a lot of schools where the parents are actually, famous actors and people like that. And so then they will insist on having a good arts program for the school. So sometimes, certain schools fare very well and have excellent programs. But then sometimes in other places, there's just the funding is cut, and the first thing that will get cut are like arts, And so then you kind of get nothing, and then that's really a problem. What I've noticed in the US is that there are a lot of organizations, because our organizations, we have some government funding, but not the same way that they would in Europe for the arts. So a lot of times the model also is based on getting grants by doing kind of educational initiatives. So a lot of like if there's a choir or an orchestra, they'll usually have an educational wing, and they'll go into the community and kind of work with the school students there. So I think between that, and then also, again, there's so many resources now available online. Like if you want to learn something, there's usually someone who can just incite your interest in something, and then you can just get to know a little bit through that. But then ultimately, I come back to this idea that mentorship is very important, because I think in addition to, there's not going to necessarily be that many kids who hear like, oh, sarega, oh, I like that. But they might see a person who they want to be like when they grow up, and they think, okay, what does that person do? And then they think, oh, okay, this person's a musician. That's really interesting and cool. Maybe I want to try that, And so I think as much just being good role models for musicians to be able to be out there as people is really important to students. Because I mean, the one thing I'll say is that for me, learning Indian classical music, I mean, imagine I had already had an undergraduate degree in music from a university before I even discovered that I had an interest in Hindustani music. And it was truly because I loved the people I knew who were Indian classical musicians. And I was just like, they're musicians, I'm a musician, how come we can't communicate? And that's why I started learning Hindustani classical music. And then I fell in love with the art form. So I think it's true for kids as well.
That is absolutely true, and that brings us to the last and final topic of our discussion, institutionalization. So as far as Hindustani music is concerned, the approach is very, very individualistic. Like, I am a student or a disciple of so and so, and I carry that brand with me. There are very few, only a handful of institutions which actually cultivate a bunch of good musicians. And one example which I must mention here is Sangeet Research Academy of Kolkata. But otherwise, the approach is very, very individualistic. So is the scene with Western classical music the same, or is it any different?
So it's interesting because the Western system evolved very similarly. So it evolved in a way where you would go and you would study with the teacher, and you would live with the teacher, and you would the teacher would, if you were a composer, the teacher would be the composer who would write the music, and you would copy the music out, and by copying it you would learn how to write music, because you would literally be writing their notes. And so
Right.
that kind of Guru-Shishya thing existed for a long time in Western classical music. And
Hmm.
music was a trade, like any other trade, where you would just learn, it'd be handed down to you.
Right.
But then I think there was a point at which uh, being part of an academy and having some kind of certification, and then also then, we have a little bit of like a job security, we have a way, a structure kind of formed around it. So that was really nice too, that, there are so many positions that actually allow you to have a little bit more structure when you get into classical music, as opposed to, say you're in an indie band or something, you just have to
Right.
take your shot and hope for the best. So, I
Right.
mean, that structure exists. So now it's almost like, a combination of both. So imagine if you had a teacher that you studied with, but just every teacher happened to teach at some university or another. And some of the best teachers teach in a similar institution, and that's an institution that's considered very good for music. So, for example,
Right.
when someone wants to go into Western classical music, I will always look at their music and say, okay, here are some composers that you might want to study with as your primary teacher, and here are the institutions they teach at. So you still go to a school for that teacher, but what you'll find is that in Western classical musicians' bios, it'll say they went to XYZ institution, but then they studied with this person, this person, this person, this person. Both are very important. And
That's
so,
right.
in a way, when you say, like, I went to Yale, a certain thing to certain people, as far as, okay, this kind of style of composers that would come out there, the breadth of those composers, and then saying that I studied with a certain teacher maybe narrows it down a little bit more as far as the kind of ideas that I would have. So it's kind of a combination of both things, and I think that there are really benefits to both of them, because there is a whole education that goes along with Western classical music, where you have courses in theory and history and ear training, and all these different kinds of counterpoint, harmony. So you get a little bit of a broader education, and then you also get to associate with a lot of different musicians. So you have undergrad for 4 years, masters for 2 years, where you spend time with other musicians and get to know them, and that's how the community builds. So, I mean, of course, the drawback then is that you are sometimes at the mercy of an institution to get a degree, and maybe you have to do a bunch of stuff you don't want to do, and we certainly have all done those things. But ultimately, being able to build that community is very important for just your perspective as a Western musician.
Another short ancillary question to this, Reena, that in the West, I have read, you have courses in the universities about music appreciation. You don't necessarily have to be a musician to take this course, but still you can learn how to listen. And these are not extracurricular, these are proper, serious UG or PG courses. So, one, how do you evaluate these courses? And two, how far are they helpful in building the community?
It's interesting because I don't know that I've ever taken a music appreciation course, because I've been a musician for too long to kind of know the other side. But I do think they're incredibly helpful, just so that people know what to listen for. And certainly I've taught those kinds of things to Hindustani musicians specifically, because, even learning something from scratch, as in, you don't know anything about any kind of music, is really different
Hmm.
than you knowing another kind of music, and just someone saying, okay, you know how you do this is this, so make this connection.
Hmm.
And then there's actually much less that has to be said when someone already has some kind of musical framework, even if that's different. But to kind of go generally into your question, I think that it's important for people to have just something to hang on to, because ultimately music is very ephemeral. You can only hear a few notes at one time, and then they're gone, and then there are other notes. And so I can just imagine, to some people it must feel like, being a sommelier feels to me, where I could drink some wine and I don't know what the taste is or what the overtones are. It feels completely elusive to me. And so just having
Right.
some way to nail it down, I think is really helpful.
All right. Thank you so much, Reena, for joining us at Musical. I'm so grateful, and I hope that the viewers of Musical have got valuable insights from this interaction.
It's been really wonderful to talk to you. I talk so much to Western musicians who want to understand Indian classical music. So it's just really a joy and so refreshing to do it the opposite way and talk to an Indian classical musician. And that's your context, and you come to Western music from that way. So thank you. This is wonderful. And for those of you who are actually Indian musicians, I encourage you to learn a little bit about Western classical music, because there's a beautiful space opening up between them that has a place for you in between these two cultures. So thanks for having me. This was really wonderful.
Thank you.